Hello. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about anticipatory grief, which is when you actually have a substantial part of a grief process before an actual change or loss actually happens in time. Stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So, in this video, I want to talk about anticipatory grief, which is when you substantially engage in a grief process before an actual change happens or a loss occurs. And I started thinking about this early in my career because I was working with two types of clients that tended to show up with something that was kind of interesting in terms of grief. One of them was in cases of divorce. So, in the early part of my career, I worked with many, many cases of divorce because for the first 5 years of my career, more than 50% of my caseload was working with high conflict divorces, families, and parents during and after the divorce process. And so, one of the things that I noticed was that when I interacted with more than one member of a family where the parents were separating, I would notice that not only were the different people in the family having their own individual grief process, because our grief process is individual, even when it's happening simultaneously within a family, because everybody in the family is experiencing similar changes at the same time. So our grief process is individual, but part of that also showed that people were actually on a different schedule with the grief process. Okay. And that didn't just mean that, a change or loss occurred and then the schedule, like the timing and the trajectory of people kind of accomplishing the tasks of adjusting and grieving was different. It also revealed that sometimes people would actually start grieving before an actual change or loss occurred. And this became most clear early on when I was working with separating parents. So I was working with people who were partners for X amount of time and at one point, had children and then were separating, which is why they were my clients because I was working with separated parents. And so what I often found was that one of the two people often started grieving at the point where they had a very compelling, concrete imagination that the partnership was going to end. Okay. And for some people, that was years before the actual divorce. Okay. And the reason that this kind of came into my awareness was because would see person A at some point react to the fact that person B had already been grieving. Okay. So, I remember some of the early manifestations of this was when, like, let's say I have a case where there's a husband and wife going through a divorce, and then the husband says to me in the session, look at her, she's not even grieving. Okay. And the implication there is that she's not having a grief process because she's evil, stupid, and crazy, probably because that's the kind of thinking that goes on in a divorce. But, the fundamental question is this person actually not grieving? Okay. And upon examination, which means talking to that person, what I often found was they actually did go through a grief process. So when I talked to the person who was being accused of actually being a monster and not grieving or incapable of grief or somehow not accomplishing appropriate grief that the other person was expecting, it was often the case that, years before the actual divorce, the person just thought, I don't think this marriage is going to work. Okay. I think we really are headed toward a divorce. And at the point where the person really compellingly imagines that's likely what I'm dealing with, or that's what I'm dealing with, or going to be dealing with, the grieving process starts. Okay. And by the grieving process, let me just say I've made videos on this channel before about what grief is, and the playlist for grief will be at the end of this video. If you want to go see me talking about the fact that grief doesn't happen in stages, but it happens with tasks, I'll put a link up here at the top if you want to go look at that video. But the thing is, so what I'm talking about with grief, and the thing that I was seeing back then, and the thing I'm talking about in this video, is not the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, but it's the accomplishing of the tasks of grief. Okay, so if we think about the tasks of grief, including having an actual meaningful reaction to the actual change or loss, when we think about it as having congruent emotions and being able to feel those emotions and being able to work through those emotions, when we think about it as meaningful adjustment to a life after the change or loss, okay, those are all things that can occur before the actual change or loss. All right. So if you have a person in a long term relationship who one day realizes, you know what, I think this is headed toward an end, our big brains are able to compellingly imagine and model that future reality in a real enough way that we go ahead and start reacting to it. We start meaningfully thinking, okay, if this marriage ends, I'll have to find a new place to live. Okay, what does that mean? That means dividing our stuff. That means me literally finding a place. That means me having to pay for rent for a new place. That means me physically moving my stuff there and situating myself there and living there and commuting to work from that location as opposed to this location. Okay, we start imagining all those things in a meaningful, compelling way. And then we actually emotionally, psychologically react to those elements of the change, even before the change occurs, and even years before the change occurs. So it became apparent to me in that setting, which means working with families going through divorce, that one or more people in the family often would actually start a fairly robust private grief process. Maybe not completely private, it sometimes was kind of part of the emotional dynamic of the relationship or the family, but it was individual in the sense that it was mostly relevant to how that person was reacting to the situation. And it did often result in a situation where, at the point where someone actually goes and files the divorce papers, and where people literally say, okay, next week we're going to separate. Okay, often one person was at a much earlier stage of meaningfully engaging in a grief process than the other person. And this was also true if you look at families, and if you have parents and kids, and also related family members who often grieve when a divorce happens. Not everybody is on the same schedule. And some of the people actually started that process before the concrete, literal change occurred in chronological time. Okay. And why was this important? Okay. So I mentioned that the way it kind of got revealed to me was often when person A looked at person B and said, you don't even seem to be grieving. You're a cold monster, narcissist without the ability to have empathy for me because you seem like you don't care about this. Okay. That perception, that disparity actually then becomes a bit of a crisis or a source of conflict. Okay. So part of the so what of this video, part of my motivation to make this video is not only to say that anticipatory grief is a thing, but one of the consequences of it is that people in families or partnerships are often not on the same schedule, and the disparity between one or two or more people in the grief process actually sometimes is a meaningful thing in terms of the dynamic between those people. Okay, so not only does grief disrupt a family in terms of its challenge, but the fact that people grieve individually but simultaneously sometimes actually is part of the chaos of the dynamic of the relationships between the people in the situation that is happening. Okay. and to put in practical terms, I can be mad at you for not grieving the same way I am. If I think you're not doing it right, or if it impacts my perception of whether you're healthy or not, so that will impact the dynamic. And obviously, people already think each other's dysfunctional at the end of a relationship during a breakup, and so it can exacerbate that. And the other thing is that it can also cause the person who had the early grief to then question whether they're okay. And I didn't see that so much with the divorce cases, because usually the person who grieved early was insightful and said, okay, yes, I started adjusting to this 5 years ago because I really did at that point see that it was very likely this was going to work out this way, and so it kind of made sense to that person. But the people that showed up who said, "Hey, this doesn't even make sense to me, and I'm wondering whether I'm crazy or not," were a different population that I have worked with over the years and continue to work with, and that is people who are caregivers or family members of people who have protracted terminal illnesses, and this showed up for me with people who had a family member that eventually died from dementia. Because one of the things that people who were family members of dementia patients, and this is often true of partners, and it was often true of adult children who were caregivers, they would sometimes show up and say, so my dad just died, and I'm not really feeling a lot of grief. Okay. Now, some people were insightful again about this and said, okay, yeah, I have been grieving the loss of this person because the dementia has taken them away. They are not, even before they physically died, they were basically taken away from me. And I've been adjusting to that for the last few years. But some people were confused about their lack of strong emotion, or their lack of significant challenge that they expected, given our reasonable expectations of what accomplishing the tasks of grief are at the time of the person's death, right? So you have someone who's, let's say, in a years long process of declining and eventually dying from dementia. And then, the person goes to the funeral and they're feeling actually fairly okay. It's not like they're 100% okay necessarily, but compared to what they expected, they're calm, adjusted. They're not feeling particularly overwhelmed. They're having congruent emotions. But sometimes people are surprised at the noticeably low magnitude of the emotions and the psychological kind of crisis that exists at the time of someone's death. And this most often, it just in my practice, the cases that I've observed this in most often has been, well, when they knew the person was going to die, and also when the person was, because of their progressive debilitation from the health issues, they were kind of taken away from them already anyway. So there were actual changes that the person had to adjust to as the family member of the person who was declining, because they were getting limited in their mobility, they were getting limited in their speech, they were getting limited in their identity, because the brain, the dementia, for example, can just take the person away. So it's not, they're largely not there, even though obviously, people with dementia can kind of show up at times very much like they were before, but dementia progressively just takes the person away because of the progressive brain damage. But in any case, so I had people who sometimes would come to therapy and say, I'm worried that I'm not grieving in the right ways or sufficiently, because I don't feel a lot of sadness and anger and the things I would expect to feel while grieving. But on examination, if I hear their story, often what I find, and this could be true of you or someone um, those elements of grief actually did show up. It's just that they showed up already. You've already accomplished the meaningful engagement with the actual change or loss. You have already worked through the congruent emotions. You have already made adjustments to life after the loss, right? And then with that second type of situation, there's often this other confusing thing, which is that I feel so much relief that they died because my role of caregiver was taking up a bigger and bigger slice of my pie, even the whole pie, and it's just been overwhelming and it's worn me out and it's diminished my life. I've been grieving the loss of the parts of my life that I had to sacrifice to be in the role of caregiver, and now that they've died, I feel I'm out from under all of that, and that's an adjustment, but it's a relief. And then people feel shame and guilt about not grieving and feel shame and guilt about feeling relieved that somebody died. Okay. But that's normal, right? Like you were under a burden and now you're not, and the lack of the burden results in you feeling relieved. Okay. So again, part of the so what of this video is that sometimes when you expect to see certain features of grief, when you don't, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're dysfunctional and you're not capable of grieving, or that you aren't grieving. It often does actually mean that you have already grieved. Okay. So the takeaways in this video are that grief is an individual process. Grief doesn't happen in stages. We accomplish the tasks of grief, basically adjusting to the change or loss. And this is something that many of us do prior to the literal actual change of loss as we would mark it in chronological time on a calendar. And the reason for that is because our big brains have the ability to anticipate meaningfully a change or loss that we think is going to occur or likely to occur. And we can have actual adjustments to that imagination in ways that do actually allow us to successfully work through the tasks of grief. So it is absolutely possible to go ahead and grieve early before an actual change or loss. It doesn't mean that there aren't more adjustments that occur after an actual change or loss. That's pretty much always true. It's just that there's enough meaningful anticipation of those adjustments that you actually can have a grief process before the change or loss. So I hope this is helpful for you. If you like this kind of content, hit the like button below because it helps train YouTube on who to show my videos to, and it gives me good feedback. And you can give me additional feedback if you want by leaving a comment below, because I welcome those. It helps me tailor the types of content that I produce for the channel. And if you have yet to subscribe, please subscribe, because I think at the time of the making of this video, I'm only 9,887 subscribers away from my goal of 10,000. So please subscribe, and I will see you in an upcoming video. Bye-bye.